A lone hiker, venturing deep into the desolate and rugged slopes of a remote mountain near Delta, made a chilling discovery. Hidden amidst jagged rocks and twisted thickets of gnarled bushes, skeletal human remains lay partially exposed, their eerie stillness broken only by the faint rustle of wind through the trees. The scene carried an unshakable sense of foreboding, amplified by its proximity to the spot where women's personal belongings had been unearthed years before. Authorities swiftly cordoned off the area, and forensic specialists were brought in to examine the scene. Their initial assessment suggested the remains might belong to Paige Bergfeld, but further analysis would be needed to confirm the identity and uncover any clues about the circumstances of her disappearance. One more important detail: a business card was discovered that pointed to Paige Bergfeld's alternate identity. This card was linked to her secret work, but what kind of work was it? And how did an ordinary business card become the key piece of evidence that unveiled a shocking secret about Paige Bergfeld's life? Paige Bergfeld entered the world on April 27, 1973, in the bustling city of Atlanta, Georgia. She was the second child born to Suzanne and Frank Bergfeld, immigrants from the distant and serene Mariana Islands. Paige's appearance added joy to a household already brightened by her older brother, Craig. Suzanne and Frank were dedicated and hardworking parents, embodying the classic immigrant story of perseverance and ambition. Despite their demanding careers, they prioritized family, creating a home filled with love, structure, and support. Frank, this man had an incredible talent for balancing his career with raising his son and daughter. His talent for navigating these spheres garnered him admiration, and his reputation for excellence caught the attention of influential figures in his field. At the National Association of Securities Dealers, Frank was offered a career opportunity too significant to decline, one that required the family to uproot and move to Colorado, a decision that shaped the trajectory of their lives. In Colorado, Paige's journey truly began to take shape. She excelled academically and demonstrated a passion for helping others, leading her to pursue a career in medicine. After completing high school, she enrolled in the nursing program at the University of Florida, an institution that would become a pivotal chapter in her life. It was here that she met Howard Beegler, a charismatic and ambitious young man. Sparks flew, and their connection quickly blossomed into a serious relationship. Their shared dreams and ambitions made them a seemingly perfect match. Paige graduated and returned to Colorado to live with her parents, but her relationship with Howard continued to flourish. By 1995, their love story culminated in a picturesque wedding. The union seemed idyllic, with friends and family admiring their compatibility and shared vision for the future. However, the early years of marriage revealed a fundamental and irreconcilable difference between Paige and Howard. Paige dreamed of becoming a mother. Howard, however, held firm to his belief in remaining child-free, a stance he considered central to his personal philosophy. This divide led to countless discussions and emotional debates. By 1997, after much heartache and deliberation, Paige and Howard made the painful decision to part ways. Yet their bond remained strong. They valued the deep friendship they had cultivated and chose to remain in each other's lives, demonstrating a maturity and mutual respect that is rare among divorced couples. The end of her marriage marked a turning point for Paige. Feeling the need to reinvent herself and explore new horizons, she sought a fresh start. She adopted the pseudonym Madison and began working at a popular strip club in Denver. The decision was bold, controversial, and reflective of her determination to take control of her destiny. It was in this unconventional environment that Paige met Rob Dixon, a man whose charm and charisma were matched by his substantial wealth. Rob was poised to inherit a lucrative family business, and the chemistry between him and Paige was undeniable. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a wedding in 1998, just a year after they met. Paige and Rob's union marked the beginning of what seemed like a fairy tale life. The couple settled in an opulent Colorado mansion, a symbol of Rob's affluence and Paige's new status. Paige's long-held dream of motherhood was finally realized when she and Rob welcomed 3 children: Taft, Trigger, and Jess. These children became the center of Paige's universe, filling her days with joy and purpose. Her life appeared picture-perfect. She was married to a man she loved deeply, lived in luxury, and had a family that brought her immeasurable happiness. With a sprawling home, expensive cars, and the ability to provide her children with the best life had to offer, Paige believed her happiness was unshakable. She was confident that this harmonious existence would last forever. Over time, cracks began to appear in the Dixon family's seemingly perfect world. Rob's business ventures, once lucrative, started encountering serious challenges. Financial instability crept into their lives, and the pressure mounted with alarming speed. The lavish lifestyle they had grown accustomed to became unsustainable. Rob's financial troubles culminated in a devastating bankruptcy. This dramatic shift from abundance to scarcity tested the couple's resilience and their ability to weather adversity together. By 2004, the situation had reached a breaking point. Arguments became a daily occurrence, and the atmosphere in the Dixon household grew increasingly toxic. During one particularly heated confrontation, Paige, feeling trapped and terrified, called emergency services. In a trembling voice, she reported that Rob had threatened not only her life, but also the lives of their children. The weight of her words conveyed the gravity of the situation and prompted an immediate response from law enforcement. Several police officers rushed to the Dixon residence, prepared to intervene and ensure the safety of Paige and her children. But when they arrived at the Dixons' house, they were met by Paige and Rob standing side by side at the door. Paige assured the officers that the situation had been resolved and that their assistance was no longer required. But a year passed, and Paige found herself calling the police once more. This time, the situation was even more alarming. She reported that Rob had physically assaulted her, and the circumstances of this incident were far more disturbing than those from a year earlier. According to Paige's statement, her husband struck her during an argument, a moment made even more harrowing because she was holding their youngest child in her arms. The act was not only an assault on her, but a direct threat to their child's safety. Rob was immediately summoned to the police station, where he was charged with third-degree assault. The seriousness of the charges underscored the escalating volatility of their relationship. During the criminal proceedings, Rob ultimately pleaded guilty to one of the charges: harassment. Despite his admission, the case was closed, allowing him to avoid prison time, a resolution that left Paige disillusioned but determined to move forward. However, the strain of these events had irreparably damaged their already fragile marriage. The atmosphere in their home became increasingly hostile, with Paige and Rob clashing over even the smallest matters. Their arguments escalated to the point where it became clear that their relationship was beyond repair. Recognizing the toxicity of their situation, they made the difficult decision to divorce. For Paige, this marked the beginning of a new chapter filled with both uncertainty and resolve. She understood that she would now bear the sole responsibility of providing for her children. Determined to create a stable life for her family, Paige threw herself into various entrepreneurial ventures. She launched a small business manufacturing baby carrier, a product inspired by her own experiences as a mother. Simultaneously, she taught dance lessons to toddlers, using her passion for movement to inspire and educate young children. In addition to these endeavors, Paige worked as a sales representative for a kitchenware company, juggling multiple roles to ensure her family's financial security. Despite her busy schedule, Paige remained a devoted mother. She actively participated in her children's lives, attending parent-teacher association meetings, organizing playdates, and fostering a nurturing environment at home. Her unwavering commitment to her children became the cornerstone of her new life. On June 28, 2007, exactly 1 year after her separation from Rob, Paige disappeared under mysterious circumstances. That morning, she left her children in the care of her close friend Carol Lindholm, who also worked part-time as her nanny. Paige had always been known for her reliability and punctuality, especially when it came to her children. So, when she failed to return home on time and did not answer her phone, concern quickly turned to alarm. Initially, Carol tried to reassure herself, believing that Paige might have been delayed by work commitments. However, as the hours passed, worry began to set in. Paige's daughter Jess, desperate to see her mother, left several voice messages pleading for her to come home.
Grandma, you are really, really mean. You said you would be back when we were talking. You haven't even been back.
Friday blurred into Saturday with no sign of Paige. The hours crawled by and the sense of dread deepened. 8-year-old Jess, weary from waiting and missing her mother terribly, urged the nanny Carol to contact the police. Unable to delay further, Carol and Jess made their way to the police station to file a missing persons report. That same day, a representative from the sheriff's office contacted Paige's father, Frank, to deliver the devastating news. Frank, seized by a growing panic, immediately attempted to call Paige, but each call went unanswered. Desperate for support and action, he reached out to his eldest son, relaying the grim developments. As the gravity of Paige's disappearance became clear, a large-scale search operation was launched. The community, friends, neighbors, and even strangers rallied alongside law enforcement. Volunteers scoured abandoned lots and nearby desert terrains, united in their determination to find Paige. The search was an immense undertaking, and it soon led to a disturbing discovery. On the first Sunday of July 2007, investigators came across Paige's red Ford Focus. The car was found abandoned and burned in an unfamiliar area with no apparent connection to Paige. The circumstances surrounding the fire were deeply suspicious. There was no evidence of a natural cause or external ignition, and the surrounding area remained untouched by flames. This strongly suggested the fire had been deliberately set, likely to obliterate crucial evidence. The district attorney quickly labeled the incident an act of arson, and what had initially been treated as a missing persons case now escalated into a suspected abduction, and perhaps even a murder investigation. Determined to piece together the truth, investigators conducted a thorough examination of the charred vehicle. Sergeant Ware of the county sheriff's office explained that arson is a common tactic employed to erase evidence such as DNA, fingerprints, or other trace materials. However, despite the extensive damage to the car, one detail stood out as a significant clue: the position of the driver's seat. It had been pushed back as far as it could go, a configuration that did not match Paige's petite stature. Standing just 164 centimeters tall, Paige would have been unable to reach the pedals from that position. This detail strongly implied that someone much taller had been the last to drive her car. The investigation took another turn when detectives opened the trunk of the burned Ford and discovered Paige's diary. Its presence raised immediate questions. Why was it there? Could it contain clues to her disappearance? As investigators delved into its contents, they uncovered yet another chilling twist. Someone had torn out several pages from the diary, specifically those covering the period between June 26th and June 29th. This discovery deepened the enigma surrounding Paige's fate. The missing pages suggested an intentional effort to conceal vital information, adding urgency to the already desperate search. Law enforcement officers expanded their efforts, methodically combing through nearby desert plots, abandoned structures, and any area that might hold a clue. The operation grew into a massive undertaking, drawing in more people as news of Paige's disappearance spread. The search effort extended beyond law enforcement. Her brother, Craig, flew in from the West Coast, leaving behind his work and personal commitments to support his parents and nephews. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Craig purchased a one-way ticket, vowing to stay in Colorado until his sister was found, no matter how long it took. His determination and resolve mirrored the collective spirit of those involved in the search. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation turned its focus toward those who had been closest to Paige. Rob, her second ex-husband, was among the first to come under scrutiny. At the time of Paige's disappearance, Rob was residing in Pennsylvania. Investigators uncovered records of 2 domestic violence reports filed by Paige during their marriage, raising questions about his potential involvement. Authorities worked to establish his whereabouts on June 28th, the day Paige vanished. Rob consistently maintained that he had been at home in Pennsylvania and denied any connection to her disappearance. To demonstrate his innocence, he not only cooperated with investigators but actively joined the search efforts. His visible concern for Paige's fate lent credibility to his statements, though detectives continued to examine every aspect of his story for inconsistencies. Another person was Howard. Paige's first husband also became a person of interest. After her divorce from Rob, Paige and Howard had rekindled a friendship that occasionally brought them together. Howard revealed that he had been one of the last people to see Paige before her sudden and mysterious disappearance. On June 28th, the two had met in Eagle County, Colorado, a convenient midpoint for both due to their business dealings. Howard described their encounter as uneventful, a routine meeting without any notable incidents. Afterward, they parted ways, though they remained in contact via phone. When news of Paige's disappearance reached Howard, he acted swiftly, contacting emergency services. During his call, he expressed deep concern, emphasizing that Paige, as a devoted mother who adored her children, would never willingly abandon them. His account was supported by cell phone tower data, which placed him in the Denver area on the day of Paige's disappearance, several hours away from where she was last seen. This evidence conclusively cleared Howard from the list of suspects, allowing investigators to focus their efforts elsewhere. A significant breakthrough in the case came just days after the discovery of Paige's burned car. A motorist, who had pulled over on a highway southeast of the city to fix a flat tire, stumbled upon a checkbook lying on the ground. Acting on his instincts, he reported the find to authorities. This led to a thorough search of the area, during which investigators unearthed several more of Paige's personal belongings. These included her medical records, insurance documents, and other essential items. The arrangement of the scattered objects posed an intriguing mystery. Sergeant Ware, one of the lead investigators on the case, theorized that Paige might have intentionally dropped these items as a desperate attempt to leave behind clues about her predicament. Of particular interest was the checkbook, from which several pages had been torn. Investigators speculated that these missing pages might contain critical information about her final days. As the search continued, a business card emerged as a pivotal piece of evidence, unraveling a shocking secret about Paige's life. The card pointed to an alternate identity. Carrie, the name Paige used in her clandestine work as an escort. This revelation sent shockwaves through her circle of family and friends, who had been completely unaware of this hidden aspect of her life. To maintain this dual existence, Paige had used a separate phone exclusively for her escort-related communications. This phone became a vital tool in the investigation. By analyzing its call history, detectives compiled a list of individuals who had interacted with Paige in the hours leading up to her disappearance. The final call made from this phone occurred on June 28th, at approximately 9 p.m., narrowing the timeline of events. From the call history, authorities identified 7 individuals as potential suspects. Among these names, one stood out: Lester Ralph Jones. Jones' background immediately drew the attention of investigators. A 55-year-old, Jones had a criminal history that included prior convictions for violence against women and kidnapping. For the latter crime, he had served a 5-year prison sentence. This history painted a disturbing portrait of a man who fit the profile of someone capable of harming Paige. Further revelations deepened the investigators' suspicions. It came to light that Jones owned a white car closely resembling a vehicle described by Carol, Paige's close friend and nanny. Carol recounted an unsettling story that Paige had shared not long before her disappearance. According to Paige, she had finished work at her rented office one evening and was heading to her parked Ford. As she approached her vehicle, she noticed an unfamiliar white car blocking her path. Despite her frustration and unease, Paige managed to maneuver her car around the obstruction. However, in the process, she inadvertently collided with the white vehicle. To her surprise, the driver of the car, rather than confronting her, sped away from the scene, leaving Paige alone. This incident, seemingly isolated at the time, now took on new significance. Investigators suspected that Lester, a man with an apparent fixation on Paige, might have been stalking her for some time. Determined to uncover the nature of their connection, the police delved into Paige's call records. What they found added to their concerns. The records revealed that Lester had attempted to schedule an appointment with Paige just one day before her disappearance. However, Paige, already acquainted with Lester, felt uneasy about meeting him. To avoid the encounter, she asked Carol, who occasionally provided massage services for Paige's escort clients, to attend the appointment in her place. Initially hesitant, Carol eventually agreed and went to meet Lester. After their disturbing meeting, Carol described Lester as an intimidatingly tall and physically imposing man. His sheer presence left her feeling uneasy, and his demeanor only heightened her discomfort. According to Carol, Lester wasted no time in making inappropriate advances and openly expressing a desire for intimacy as soon as they met. Carol, resolute and unshaken, firmly rejected his advances, warning him that she would not hesitate to involve the police if he persisted. This conversation added another layer of concern to Lester's already disturbing picture of behavior. As investigators delved deeper into Lester's background, they uncovered another alarming detail: His workshop was situated mere meters from the location where Paige's car had been discovered burning. The proximity of his workplace to such a critical scene immediately raised suspicions. When summoned for questioning, however, Lester presented himself as calm and cooperative. He answered all of the detective's questions, denied any connection to Paige's disappearance, and even voluntarily provided his fingerprints and DNA samples for analysis. His polished demeanor and seemingly ordinary appearance initially caused some to question whether he could truly be involved in such a heinous crime. Yet there was one critical detail investigators could not overlook. Lester's towering height, measuring 2 meters, perfectly matched the positioning of the driver's seat in Paige's Ford. This observation suggested that someone of Lester's stature was likely the last person to operate the vehicle. Armed with this knowledge, detectives secured a warrant to search Lester's residence. What they found inside his home deepened their suspicions. The search uncovered a disturbing array of items, including a disposable phone, several men's wigs, a bottle of Viagra, a piece of paper with the words "massage" and Paige's escort service number scrawled on it, and an assortment of women's underwear and bras in various sizes. Of all the items, the disposable phone drew the most scrutiny. Investigators linked it to a series of calls made to Paige on the day of her disappearance, all originating from an unregistered number. When confronted, Lester flatly denied owning a disposable phone. However, the packaging for one was found among his belongings. Tracing its purchase, detectives discovered that it had been bought at a supermarket on North Avenue. Surveillance footage from the store provided the confirmation they needed. Lester was clearly seen buying the phone. Even when shown the CCTV footage, Lester stubbornly denied that the man in the video was him, a claim that investigators found both baffling and telling. The investigation took an even more dramatic turn when a police canine unit was deployed to assist. The dog's heightened senses confirmed that Paige's body had been inside the burned-out car at some point. Chillingly, the dog also detected Lester's scent within the vehicle, establishing a direct link between him and the crime scene. Despite these damning findings, the evidence against Lester remained largely circumstantial. Investigators knew they needed irrefutable proof to definitively tie him to Paige's disappearance. The lack of a body and the complexities of Paige's hidden lifestyle posed significant challenges. Sergeant Ware explained that, despite the overwhelming suspicion surrounding Lester, the prosecutor's office ultimately decided not to press charges. Without Paige's remains and with no conclusive evidence, building a case strong enough to stand up in court was deemed impossible. The investigation stalled, leaving Paige's family and friends in limbo. For 5 agonizing years, they lived with unanswered questions, clinging to fading hope and grappling with their grief. In 2012, a discovery shattered the silence surrounding Paige's case. A hiker exploring a remote mountain slope near Delta stumbled upon human remains partially concealed among rocks and dense bushes. The location was eerily close to the area where Paige's personal belongings had been discovered years earlier. Forensic experts were called to the scene, and their initial assessment suggested that the remains likely belonged to Paige. DNA analysis and a dental examination soon confirmed their suspicions. The remains were indeed those of the missing mother. The evidence at the scene painted a harrowing picture of Paige's final moments. Investigators hypothesized that she had been taken to the desolate hill, bound with duct tape across her mouth to silence her cries for help. Although the condition of the remains made it impossible to determine an exact cause of death, the experts concluded that Paige had been savagely beaten. Multiple bones, including facial ones, were fractured, pointing to a brutal assault as the likely cause of her death. Additionally, it appeared that her body had initially been buried, only to resurface over time due to soil erosion and the natural effects of weathering. Paige's funeral was held on April 28, 2012, providing her loved ones with a semblance of closure after years of anguish. However, the search for justice was far from over. More than 2 years after her remains were found, in November 2014, Lester was arrested and formally charged with kidnapping, first-degree intentional homicide, and second-degree murder. For Paige's family, the arrest was a long-awaited step forward, but the legal battle that followed would be another arduous ordeal. The trial did not commence until July 2016, nearly 4 years after the discovery of Paige's remains. Lasting 22 days, the proceedings painted a chilling portrait of the man accused of taking her life. The prosecution argued that Lester, known for his history of aggression toward women, had become enraged after Paige refused to schedule a second meeting following their initial encounter. Their case relied heavily on testimony from Lester's ex-wife, Lisa, whose harrowing experiences shed light on the defendant's violent tendencies. Lisa recounted a terrifying incident from the late 1990s when Lester had kidnapped her at gunpoint, threatening to kill her. According to her testimony, he was consumed by jealousy after she left him for another man. In a fit of rage, Lester tracked them down and attacked her new partner, shooting him in the head. Just a month later, he confronted Lisa again, forcibly dragging her into his car and declaring his intention to kill her and dispose of her body in a lake. Miraculously, Lisa managed to escape and reported the incidents to the police, leading to Lester's arrest on charges of kidnapping and assault. This history of violence added weight to the prosecution's argument that Lester had the capacity and motive to harm Paige. In response to the prosecution's case, Lester's defense team worked tirelessly to dismantle the narrative presented in court. They argued that the police had zeroed in on the wrong suspect and neglected to investigate other plausible leads, particularly the clients of Paige's escort business. Despite their claims, the defense failed to present any credible alternative suspects or compelling theories that could exonerate Lester. To complicate matters further, Lester chose not to take the stand during his trial, leaving his defense reliant on discrediting the evidence presented by the prosecution rather than providing a substantive counter-narrative. The prosecution, however, was prepared to reinforce their case with damning evidence. Among the key elements presented were recordings of phone conversations between Lester and the police. These recordings shed light on Lester's behavior and reactions during the investigation. After inspecting Lester's car, detectives informed him that they had found nothing incriminating and would return the vehicle shortly. This ruse was intended to make Lester feel at ease and potentially lower his guard. Instead, his response raised alarm bells. Rather than expressing relief, Lester displayed an unusual level of concern, repeatedly questioning whether the car would actually be returned. This nervous wariness only served to heighten suspicions about his involvement. Additional testimony from Lester's current wife further complicated his defense. She admitted to being deeply troubled by revelations of her husband's associations with prostitutes, a betrayal that strained their marriage. Despite her personal feelings, she testified that her Christian values prevented her from leaving him. However, her testimony proved to be a double-edged sword. She recognized her husband in surveillance footage from a store where he was seen purchasing a disposable phone, the same phone linked to calls made to Paige shortly before her disappearance. This admission directly contradicted Lester's earlier claims, in which he had denied owning such a phone, undermining his credibility and weakening the defense's arguments. On September 9, 2016, after weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury found itself at an impasse. Unable to reach a unanimous verdict, the court was forced to declare a mistrial. This outcome was a significant setback for the prosecution, delaying justice for Paige and her grieving family. Despite this, the district attorney remained steadfast, confident in the strength of the evidence and determined to bring Lester to justice. Plans for a retrial were set in motion, with the prosecution vowing to strengthen their case further. The months that followed saw meticulous preparation from the prosecution team. They spent days re-examining every piece of evidence, scrutinizing witness statements, and seeking new angles to reinforce their argument. On November 21, 2016, 73 days after the mistrial was declared, Lester once again stood trial. This time, the prosecution presented a bolstered case, complete with additional evidence that painted a clearer and more damning picture of his involvement in Paige's disappearance. A key revelation during the second trial was surveillance footage obtained from cameras near Lester's workplace. The footage shows a white Chevrolet, later identified as belonging to Lester's wife, driving past Paige's Ford several times just days before she disappeared. Significantly, the car appeared in the vicinity at times corresponding with persistent calls to Paige's phone. Investigators confirmed that Lester's wife had been out of town during this period, making it highly likely that Lester had been using her vehicle to stalk Paige. This revelation added a chilling layer to the prosecution's case, suggesting premeditation and a pattern of behavior that could not be easily dismissed. As in the first trial, the defense maintained that there was no direct evidence linking Lester to the crime. They continued to argue that the case was built on circumstantial evidence and conjecture, pointing to potential alternative suspects. One such alternative theory focused on a man who had died in 2011 and who had initially been considered a suspect in Paige's murder. The defense highlighted this individual's history of violence and his connections to Paige's clandestine business as evidence that he could have been responsible. However, this theory failed to account for the overwhelming new details revealed during the second trial. One of the most damning inconsistencies in Lester's account emerged during testimony regarding his alibi on the night of Paige's disappearance. According to statements, Lester had left his home for approximately an hour that evening. When questioned by his wife about his whereabouts, he claimed that he needed to return to his workshop to turn off a light he had forgotten to switch off earlier. This explanation raised eyebrows, particularly given the timing and the proximity of his workshop to the area where Paige's car and belongings had been discovered. During the proceedings, the judges in the second trial clarified an important legal point. The kidnapping and intentional murder under aggravating circumstances should be treated as a single, unified crime. This determination underscored the premeditated nature of the acts committed against Paige. However, this clarification did not alter the trajectory of the trial or the eventual outcome. Despite the years of uncertainty and the grueling legal battles, Paige's loved ones achieved the justice they had sought for so long. The parties delivered their closing arguments on December 2, 2016, and on December 27. Just before the end of the year, the jury finally reached a verdict. Lester was found guilty on all counts related to Paige's death. Although he never admitted his guilt and did not reveal the motives for the crime, the judge sentenced the man to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Lester filed an appeal, but in June 2022, a panel of 3 judges upheld the verdict. Early in the morning, firefighter George Tiaffay had just finished a grueling 24-hour shift at the fire station. Exhausted but relieved to finally spend time with his daughter, he drove to his grandmother's house to pick up 8-year-old Madison. As they drove home, Madison suddenly, remembering that she had forgotten something important at her mother's apartment. As they approached the townhouse, an unsettling feeling crept over him. A heavy weight settled in his chest as he stepped inside, and in that instant, his world shattered. There, sprawled across the living room floor, lay Shauna's lifeless body. Her face was barely recognizable, bruised, bloodied, beaten beyond comprehension. The brutality was staggering. This documentary will focus on Shauna Castleton, was born on March 13, 1966 in Salt Lake City, Utah, to William and Nancy Castleton. She was the second daughter in a large, bustling household, growing up with her older sister Paula and 5 younger brothers. In 1978, when Shauna was just 12 years old, the family relocated to Pennsylvania due to her father's work. The move was a significant change, but Shauna took it in stride, adapting quickly to her new environment. Just 2 years later, in 1980, the Castletons moved once again, this time to Northern Virginia. By now, Shauna was a young teenager, and such transitions might have been challenging for some, but not for her. What truly set Shauna apart was her personality. She had an effervescent energy that could light up any room, a trait that remained with her throughout her life. People gravitated toward her because of her warm and welcoming presence. At work, she was known for her thoughtful surprises, bringing cupcakes for coworkers' birthdays, leaving little notes of encouragement, and making sure no one ever felt forgotten. Her genuine warmth and kindness left a lasting impression on everyone she met. For someone as dynamic and full of life as Shauna, there was no better city to call home than Las Vegas. At the age of 28, in 1994, she made the bold decision to move to the vibrant desert city in search of opportunity. Initially, she found work in the cosmetics department of Fifth Avenue, a high-end department store. Though she enjoyed working with beauty products and interacting with customers, Shauna soon realized that retail wasn't where her heart lay. She longed for the pulse of Las Vegas nightlife, the energy, the thrill, something more suited to her outgoing nature. It wasn't long before she found her true calling. Shauna secured a position as a cocktail waitress at a newly opened casino, stepping into a world that suited her perfectly. With her dazzling smile, sharp wit, and boundless charm, she quickly became a favorite among both her colleagues and the casino's patrons. Over the next 11 years, she built a solid reputation as one of the most beloved waitresses in the establishment. By the early 2000s, she was making an impressive income, earning over $100,000 annually between salary and tips. Her natural beauty, coupled with her infectious personality, made her a magnet for attention. Men frequently asked her out, hoping to win her over, but Shauna remained selective. She wasn't interested in casual flings. She was holding out for something real. Then, one fateful evening, everything changed. About a year into her job at the casino, Shauna locked eyes with a man across the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and effortlessly handsome, with the kind of presence that turned heads wherever he went. His warm, confident smile caught her attention immediately, and the intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down her spine. His name was George Tiaffay, a firefighter with the Las Vegas Fire Department. From the very beginning, there was something electric between them. Their connection was immediate and undeniable. George was not only physically striking, he had an athletic build, chiseled features, and the kind of strong, steady hands that came with his line of work. But he also had a magnetic personality. His charm was effortless, his laugh deep and reassuring. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, risking his own life to save strangers. As Shauna got to know him, she realized he was even more remarkable than he appeared. After graduation, he had attended the prestigious United States Military Academy and later served in the Army Corps of Engineers. He had spent years building schools and water supply systems in impoverished regions, sending the majority of his earnings home to support his mother and his disabled sister. He was selfless, strong, and compassionate, a rare combination that made Shauna fall for him completely. Just a year after their first meeting, their whirlwind romance culminated in the birth of their daughter, Madison. The arrival of their baby girl was the happiest moment of Shauna's life. From that moment on, her priorities shifted entirely. Motherhood became her greatest joy, and she devoted every free moment to her little one. Because both Shauna and George worked demanding jobs with irregular hours, Madison often stayed with her grandmother. But Shauna never let a moment go to waste. Whenever she picked up her daughter, she showered her with affection, making up for the lost time with endless hugs, bedtime stories, and whispered "I love yous." Every day, she marveled at how lucky she was to have this perfect little family. When Madison turned 3, George and Shauna finally got married in March 2006. The newlyweds held a private wedding ceremony in Hawaii, just a few days after Shauna's 40th birthday. The first few years after the wedding, Shauna and George genuinely appeared content in their marriage. They were devoted to each other, raising their daughter with love and care, and for a while, life seemed to follow the fairy tale script. But as in many stories, happiness has a fragile quality, and it didn't take long for cracks to appear in their seemingly perfect life. The bliss of their early years together gradually gave way to tension and conflict. The shift began after the financial collapse of 2008, when the economic downturn and housing crisis struck them hard. Like so many others, the Tiaffays found themselves struggling to stay afloat. They lost a significant amount of money, and with that loss came a change in George, a drastic, unsettling transformation. Once a loving and supportive husband, he became bitter, resentful, and increasingly aggressive. It was as if the man Shauna had once loved so deeply had been replaced by someone unrecognizable. The financial hardship seemed to amplify his worst qualities, turning him into someone filled with jealousy and anger. At first, Shauna tried to be understanding. She knew times were hard and stress was at an all-time high, but what she couldn't ignore was how George's behavior toward her had shifted. She confided in friends that he had become hypercritical, scrutinizing everything she did. It started with small things, disapproving glances at how she arranged the kitchen, irritated sighs when she bought something minor for Madison. But it quickly escalated. He began counting every dollar she spent, making snide remarks about her choices and belittling her efforts at every turn. Then there was the moment that shattered whatever love and respect she still had for him. One evening, as Shauna was getting ready for work, George crossed a line he could never uncross. He called her a woman of ill repute, a degrading insult he hurled at her right in front of their young daughter. Madison, just a child, had watched in stunned silence, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. It was at that moment that Shauna realized the extent of George's resentment. His anger wasn't just about their financial struggles. It was about his own sense of inadequacy. He couldn't handle the fact that his wife was now the primary breadwinner. His wounded pride transformed into an unbearable insecurity, and instead of dealing with it constructively, he took it out on her in the cruelest of ways. As their marriage continued to unravel, George's behavior became increasingly erratic. His actions no longer seemed grounded in logic, but rather in an attempt to assert control. Despite his wife, he formed an unlikely friendship with a homeless drifter, a man who had nowhere to go and nothing to lose. Without consulting Shauna, George invited this stranger onto their property and began hiring him for odd jobs. This man, unkempt, unpredictable, and unsettling, became a looming presence in Shauna's life. She often found herself alone in the house with Madison while the drifter lingered outside, doing chores George had assigned him. Something about him made her skin crawl. His gaze lingered too long, his presence felt invasive, and there was an unspoken menace in his demeanor that set her on edge. Every time she voiced her concerns to George, he dismissed her fears, waving them away as paranoia. It was as if he took pleasure in her discomfort, relishing the fact that she no longer felt safe in her own home. The realization hit her hard. Her husband no longer cared about her well-being. The man who had once vowed to protect her now seemed indifferent to her distress. Shauna had always envisioned a different kind of life. A cozy home filled with warmth, laughter, and love. She had dreamt of a marriage built on mutual respect, of a husband who cherished her, and of a daughter who would grow up surrounded by unwavering parental support. But instead, she found herself trapped in a situation where indifference, resentment, and control had replaced love. The weight of it all became unbearable. As the months passed, hope dwindled. Every attempt at rekindling what they once had was met with cold detachment. By April 2012, Shauna had reached her breaking point. She finally made the painful decision to leave. Though the decision was agonizing, she knew it was the only way to protect herself and her daughter. She agreed to share custody of Madison, hoping that even in separation, George would remain a decent father. And despite everything, a small part of her, a part still clinging to optimism, hoped that perhaps in time they could mend the damage. Shauna even attempted marriage counseling as a last-ditch effort. But it was there, in the counselor's office, that she faced the harsh truth. It was over. The man sitting beside her in those sessions was not the man she had married. He was no longer the kind, passionate firefighter she had once fallen for. That summer, Shauna's life underwent a massive transformation. She channeled her energy into her job, excelling in her career despite the emotional turmoil. She moved into a modest but cozy townhouse in suburban Summerlin, Nevada, just 30 minutes from the casino where she worked. It wasn't the sprawling family home she had once imagined, but it was hers. The townhouse had its own private entrance, a garage, and just enough space for her and Madison to start fresh. She worked tirelessly to turn it into a sanctuary, a home filled with warmth and stability for her daughter. Despite her long work hours and the exhaustion that often accompanied them, she never let her struggles show. She remained the same optimistic, determined woman she had always been. One time, in early September, Shauna finished her casino shift as usual and headed home. Just stepping inside her apartment, Shauna's heart pounded as she immediately sensed something was off. A cold chill ran down her spine as her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything out of place. It was unmistakable. Someone had been there before her. It couldn't even be called a typical burglary. Oddly enough, all her valuable items remained untouched. However, one thing was missing: her wedding ring. That alone was disturbing enough, but the discovery that followed made the situation far more unsettling. As she checked her belongings, she noticed something else was missing: a bottom piece of her swimsuit. But even more bizarre was what had been left behind in its place. A pair of men's boxer shorts, small in size, folded neatly as if deliberately left there for her to find. The entire situation was beyond comprehension. The idea of a stranger sifting through her private possessions, touching her things, and leaving behind this sickening calling card left her shaken. And yet, despite the terror creeping into her bones, she wasn't sure what to do. Reporting it to the police felt almost ridiculous. What would she even say? That someone had stolen a swimsuit bottom and left their underwear behind? It sounded more like a twisted prank than an actual crime. Her natural optimism pushed her to dismiss the incident, convincing herself that it was an isolated event, that nothing worse would happen. And so, despite the deep discomfort festering inside her, Shauna took no further steps to secure her home. She didn't change the locks. She didn't install a security system. She simply carried on, willing herself to believe that it was nothing more than a bizarre one-time intrusion. On the morning of September 29, 2012, just past 3 a.m., casino surveillance cameras captured footage of 46-year-old Shauna Tiaffay wrapping up her shift. She looked exhausted but content as she left the casino parking lot and got into her car, beginning the 30-minute drive to her suburban Summerlin apartment. She had done this routine hundreds of times before. The moment she parked her car in the garage and stepped out, a predator was waiting. Shauna barely had time to react before she was ambushed on the stairwell leading to her apartment. The attack was savage, unrelenting, and utterly merciless. Her screams were muffled in the dead of night as she fought with every ounce of strength she had. But it wasn't enough. Her attacker ensured there would be no witnesses, no opportunity for survival. It was only after her death was confirmed that the attacker finally disappeared into the shadows. For 6 agonizing hours, her body lay there, undisturbed, unseen, as the world carried on oblivious to the horror that had just unfolded. It wasn't until 9 a.m. that she was finally discovered, and in the most tragic of circumstances. That morning, George Tiaffay had finished a grueling 24-hour shift at the fire station and went to pick up their 8-year-old daughter, Madison, from his mother's house. It had been a normal day, just like any other weekend. But as they drove back toward, Madison suddenly remembered she had forgotten something important at her mother's apartment. She asked her father to stop by so she could retrieve it. As George approached the townhouse, something immediately felt wrong. The garage door was slightly ajar. It wasn't locked. A sense of unease settled over him. He went inside, only to be met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Shauna's lifeless body lay sprawled on the living room floor, her face a mangled of blood and bruises. The brutality was staggering. Blood pooled around her, seeping into the carpet, staining everything in its path. Madison let out a piercing scream as George immediately ushered her outside, shielding her from the grisly sight. His hands trembled as he dialed 911. His voice strained with shock and devastation as he reported the gruesome discovery. He told the dispatcher everything he knew, that he hadn't seen his wife in nearly 2 days, and that they had been living separately for months. When paramedics arrived, they confirmed what George already knew. Shauna was dead. There was nothing they could do. The police initially suspected a gunshot wound to the head due to the sheer amount of blood, but closer examination revealed a far more brutal reality. Shauna had been bludgeoned to death, 17 blows to the head, each one crushing, relentless. The fingers on her right hand were broken, evidence that she had desperately tried to shield herself, to fight back. It had been a slow, agonizing death. As investigators began piecing together the timeline, they spoke to neighbors, one of whom reported hearing strange noises around 3:30 a.m. coming from Shauna's apartment. But at the time, he had dismissed it, assuming it was nothing more than the usual late-night activity. He never imagined it was the sound of a woman fighting for her life. The murder sent shockwaves through the Summerlin community. Shauna's colleagues were horrified. Naturally, the first suspect was George. As Shauna's estranged husband, he had both a clear motive and potential opportunity. A messy divorce, unresolved resentment. It all seemed to fit. But as investigators dug deeper, they quickly realized George had an airtight alibi. He had been at the fire station for an entire 24-hour shift, surrounded by multiple colleagues who could vouch for his whereabouts. Investigators officially ruled out George as a suspect, his alibi airtight and supported by multiple witnesses. Shauna's close friends and family revealed a disturbing detail. Someone had broken into her apartment just weeks before her murder. Strangely, nothing of significant value was stolen. The only items missing were her wedding ring and the bottom half of her swimsuit. This revelation shifted the investigation toward a different theory. Was her murder the work of a stalker? Perhaps someone who had become obsessed with her, watching her from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? Could one of her admirers have developed an unhealthy fixation, turning rejection into rage? Could an unhinged suitor, spurned and humiliated, have decided to take revenge in the most violent way possible? The idea was chilling but plausible. Investigators knew they had to consider every angle, and the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. The investigation into Shauna Tiaffay's tragic death gained momentum at an astonishing pace. Just 48 hours later, police received a phone call. The caller was a man named William Panks, better known as Big Will, a longtime Las Vegas resident with a reputation for knowing the ins and outs of the city's underbelly. He worked as a maintenance master for an apartment complex, but more notably, he was known for his commitment to helping former convicts reintegrate into society. However, nothing could have prepared him for the horrifying confession he was about to hear from a so-called friend. According to Big Will, a man he knew had shown up at his place, brimming with excitement. The man was practically giddy, eager to share what he considered incredible news. As Big Will listened, a cold dread settled in his gut. The visitor, his so-called friend, boasted that the previous night he had sent a woman to the other world. The spoke of the act as if it were a triumphant victory, as though he had accomplished some grand mission. With a twisted grin, he declared that he was now free, that he would leave town and start a new, lavish life. Horrified, Big Will demanded to know what exactly the man had done. The response was chilling. The killer described how he had beaten the woman to death with a hammer, striking her repeatedly until the tool itself snapped in half. Big Will had spent years helping ex-convicts turn their lives around, guiding them toward redemption. But this was beyond redemption. This was a level of evil he could not ignore. When he later saw the news report about a woman brutally murdered in her own home, he knew without a doubt that his so-called friend was responsible. The weight of that knowledge pressed on him until he could no longer remain silent. He picked up the phone and called the police. At first, detectives were skeptical. The story seemed almost too outlandish, too grotesque to be true. But they knew they had no choice but to follow the lead. Big Will provided them with a name: Noel Stevens, a drifter who lived at the outskirts of the city, far from the glittering lights of the Strip, in a makeshift tent at the foot of the hills. Stevens had a criminal record, but nothing that pointed to violence. He had spent years in and out of jail for petty crimes, prohibited substances possession, theft, and minor disturbances. Yet now he was being accused of a brutal, calculated murder. With no known connection between Stevens and Shauna, detectives struggled to piece together a motive. Why would a criminal suddenly target a respected casino worker? What linked their paths? At first glance, it made no sense. But one thing was clear: they needed to find Stevens and search for evidence. Since Big Will didn't know exactly where Stevens was staying, he led police to a grocery store where the drifter often loitered. As fate would have it, detectives didn't have to wait long. By sheer coincidence, they spotted Stevens right outside the store. The moment they saw him, they moved in. Stevens was arrested on the spot for possession of illegal substances, but as officers placed him in custody, his reaction was immediate and volatile. He erupted in anger, screaming that they had the wrong man. He denied everything, his protests growing more desperate by the second. Yet despite his frantic denials, something about him unsettled the detectives. His erratic behavior, the wild look in his eyes, it all pointed to something dark lurking beneath the surface. Still, a burning question remained. Why would a man with no history of violent crime suddenly commit such a savage act? To get answers, investigators knew they needed more than just a gut feeling. They needed hard evidence. And so, while Stevens sat in a holding cell, officers launched an exhaustive search for his temporary dwelling. They brought in a helicopter and an extensive search team to comb through each of the rugged hills and the sprawling foothills of the Rocky Desert, approximately 7 miles from the glimmering cityscape of Las Vegas. It was a grueling effort, But the painstaking search soon paid off. Hidden among the rough terrain, detectives stumbled upon an old, tattered tent, its fabric worn and riddled with patches. A makeshift shelter belonging to none other than Noel Stevens. This grim discovery would set the wheels of justice in motion. Nearby, under a thick bush, investigators unearthed a chilling piece of evidence: pants heavily stained with blood. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the blood belonged to none other than Shauna Tiaffay. The grim realization sent a jolt through the investigation team. Inside the tent, amid the stench of neglect and discarded belongings, officers also uncovered a significant clue: a crumpled price tag with a barcode. The tag traced back to a hammer purchased just a day before the crime at a local supermarket, tying Stevens even closer to the brutal murder. Back at police headquarters, detectives confronted Noel Stevens with the damning evidence. Instead of outright denial, the suspect's demeanor changed. Employing an old interrogation technique, detectives played a psychological game, telling Stevens that someone had framed him for the crime. It was a calculated gamble, and it paid off. The vagrant, initially wary, suddenly dropped his guard. Rather than fighting the accusation, he stunned detectives by confessing outright. He admitted that he had, in fact, been the one who attacked Shauna Tiaffay. He detailed his horrifying actions with unsettling nonchalance, his words painting a picture of the violent attack. However, one crucial question still loomed over the case. Why? Detectives sensed that Stevens was holding back. The answer to this mystery came when officers conducted a thorough examination of Stevens's mobile phone. In his contact list, among unfamiliar names, was one that stood out: George. The investigators felt an eerie sense of déjà vu. George. Could it really be the same George? The only George they had been focused on since the beginning. The victim's estranged husband? Their suspicions solidified when they cross-referenced the call logs. George's number had appeared repeatedly in Stevens's recent call history. A deeper dive into phone records revealed an even more shocking truth. George and Stevens had contacted each other 87 times in the month leading up to Shauna's murder. This was no coincidence. Their association went back several years. George had found in Stevens the perfect pawn. He used the homeless man for odd jobs around the house, not out of generosity, but as a calculated move to infuriate Shauna. Even after Stevens lost his home and descended into homelessness, George maintained contact with him. He had played a long game, slowly manipulating Stevens into becoming his weapon. The relationship between the two men was a deeply disturbing one. Detectives suspected that Stevens suffered from mental instability, which George had exploited to his advantage. The vagrant had become deeply attached to George, idolizing him, treating him as a savior and closest confidant. Stevens would do anything for George, and George knew it. He had expertly molded the drifter into a willing participant in his deadly scheme. But the final nail in George's coffin came when detectives revisited the hammer's barcode and traced it to a major retail store nearby. Determined to find undeniable proof, they embarked on a painstaking task, scouring through hundreds of hours of security footage. What they found left no room for doubt. There, in crystal-clear surveillance footage, George Tiaffay and Noel Stevens could be seen together, casually shopping. The footage captured them selecting a hammer, a ski mask, and black clothing. Meanwhile, back in the interrogation room, Stevens continued to spill his secrets. As he spoke, the true horror of their plan unfolded. George had promised him $600 up front to kill Shauna and assured him there would be more. Several $1,000s once he collected the life insurance payout. The murder had been meticulously planned. George had mapped out every step. They had debated multiple ways to execute the crime, but in the end, they settled on a staged home invasion. It was then that the investigators realized the break-in that had occurred 3 weeks before the murder had not been random at all. It had been a test run, a rehearsal. Stevens had been instructed to enter Shauna's home to familiarize himself with the layout, ensuring he wouldn't make mistakes when the time came for the real attack. George had even given his accomplice permission to steal something, his wife's wedding ring, as a small bonus, something he could pawn for extra cash. Then, after hours of grueling interrogation, Noel Stevens finally agreed to show police where he had buried the murder weapon. The hammer, now broken into 2 jagged pieces, that he had used to bludgeon Shauna Tiaffay to death in one of the most horrific crimes the city had seen in years. As he guided police to the desolate location where he had discarded the hammer, Stevens recounted in chilling detail the moments leading up to Shauna's death. With his confession and the recovered murder weapon, police had enough to charge George Tiaffay as an accomplice. But instead of moving swiftly to arrest the firefighter, investigators made an unusual move. They reached out to his mother and sister first, informing them that George was now implicated in Shauna's murder. It was the 9th day since Shauna's tragic death when George's family received the devastating news. Overcome with shock, his mother and sister did exactly what detectives had anticipated. They immediately called George. The conversation was brief but impactful, as officers, who had been keeping George under surveillance and monitoring his calls, listened in. They heard his sister's trembling voice telling him that he was now considered guilty of his wife's murder. The effect was instantaneous. Within seconds of hanging up, George Tiaffay bolted out of his house, leaped into his truck, and tore out of the driveway at reckless speed. His panicked, erratic driving sent him weaving through traffic, his truck veering dangerously as he sped onto Summerlin Parkway. He pushed the accelerator past 85 miles per hour, his thoughts racing faster than his vehicle. Then, in what police believe was a desperate suicide attempt, he made no effort to slow down, no attempt to swerve or brake. Instead, he plowed straight into a concrete barrier at full speed. By some cruel twist of fate, he survived. Emergency responders arrived at the scene expecting to find a fatality. Yet despite the devastating impact, George had miraculously lived, thanks to the seatbelt he had instinctively fastened. He was rushed to a local hospital where detectives wasted no time. As he lay in his hospital bed, battered but conscious, officers moved in and formally arrested him. When informed of the charges, that he was being accused of orchestrating Shauna's murder, George simply looked up from his hospital bed, eyes blank, and muttered, "Okay." Meanwhile, at the police station, Noel Stevens was officially charged as well. The swift resolution of the case sent waves of relief through Shauna's grieving family. Justice, it seemed, would finally be served. But had George succeeded in his suicide attempt, he would have evaded retribution entirely. A thought that haunted Shauna's loved ones. In the end, fate had intervened, ensuring that he would face the full weight of the law. Over 3 months later, Noel Stevens entered a guilty plea to Shauna's murder. The prosecution, in exchange for his cooperation, agreed not to seek the death penalty, but there was one condition. He had to testify against George. This posed a challenge, as Stevens remained deeply attached to his so-called friend, reluctant to betray the man he had once idolized. However, Stevens was highly impressionable, easily swayed, and the legal team eventually convinced him to cooperate as a prosecution witness. Despite George's adamant denials of any involvement in the crime, the case proceeded to trial in August 2015. However, the defense came prepared. George's lawyer wasted no time in attacking Stevens' credibility, portraying him as an unreliable witness. The defense described his testimony as an elaborate fabrication, a desperate attempt by a repeat offender to shift the blame onto an innocent man. Under cross-examination, Stevens wavered. He admitted to suffering from visual hallucinations and hearing voices in his head. He acknowledged his history of substance abuse and his dependency on alcohol. The defense capitalized on this, painting him as a man detached from reality, someone who could hardly differentiate between fact and fantasy. His credibility crumbled with each passing moment. The prosecution's main task was to convince the jury that the seemingly perfect George Tiaffay was capable of a brutal crime. And the prosecution had much more evidence than just the words of a questionable witness. The trial lasted a full week, during which the jury heard testimony from nearly 40 witnesses and examined over 400 pieces of physical evidence. After extensive deliberation, the 12 jurors retreated behind closed doors to determine George Tiaffay's fate. For 3 agonizing days, the tension in the courthouse was palpable. The weight of the case bore down on both families, each clinging to their own version of the truth. Finally, the verdict was read. George Tiaffay guilty on all charges, conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder. The sentence was unequivocal and final, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Noel Stevens, the man who had physically carried out George's plan, had also faced the weight of the justice system. Though his role was different, his punishment was equally severe, life imprisonment with a minimum of 42 years behind bars. The quiet town of Malvisanti was awakened by the desperate cries of a man. Peering out their windows, residents saw their neighbor, 31-year-old Carlo Lissi, calling for help. He appeared frightened and disoriented, mumbling incoherently and pleading for someone to call the police. As people from nearby homes gathered, Carlo revealed that his entire family had been victimized by intruders who had broken into their home. While waiting for authorities to arrive, the emergency operator instructed Carlo to check if his family members had a pulse and to perform CPR if there were any signs of life. Carlo's response was chilling. He screamed that he would not step inside the house again or touch the bodies. While he had miraculously survived because he was out with friends at a local sports bar watching the soccer match between Italy and England, he mentioned that everything seemed normal when he left his house earlier that night. But upon returning, he found his home in disarray and the lifeless bodies of his 38-year-old wife, Christina, their 5-year-old daughter, and their 1.5-year-old son. Christina Lissi, born Christina Omas, came into the world on September 17, 1975, in the small northern Italian town of Pavia, becoming the eldest child in her family. From a young age, she exhibited a strong-willed, independent, and highly ambitious nature, always marching to the beat. She possessed leadership qualities and was constantly striving to excel in whatever she undertook, whether it was her schoolwork, performances in the drama club, or any day-to-day activities. Christina was someone who always had a wide circle of friends, thanks to her excellent organizational skills and the ability to lead. After finishing high school, she was accepted into a prestigious university in Milan and soon moved out of her parents' home to start an independent life. Despite this, she maintained a close relationship with her family, staying in constant touch, and her parents knew they could always rely on their eldest daughter. At the age of 19, while still attending university, Christina took a job at a branch of a major Italian insurance company located in Malvisanti. She quickly earned the respect of her superiors and colleagues, and her career was on a fast track to success. Upon graduation, she had a wide array of opportunities before her, but instead of moving to a big city, she chose to stay closer to home in the countryside. By this time, she had already received a promotion at work and assumed a managerial position, becoming a leading specialist in the field of civil insurance. However, even as she grew into an adult and a successful woman, Christina never gave up her youthful passion for theater. She dedicated all her spare time to rehearsals and performing on stage, particularly enjoying musical productions due to her strong voice and impeccable musical ear. In Malvisanti, she had her admirers and was sometimes even recognized on the streets. Yet Christina's personal life didn't seem to fall into place as smoothly. She had many suitors and occasional romances, but most of the men she encountered seemed frivolous, unreliable, and unsuitable for a serious relationship or family life. She held on to the belief that she would eventually find her true love and achieve happiness. And so it happened. She met a man who she liked right away. It was Carlo Lissi entered the world in the fall of 1982 in the Italian commune of Casarano as the eldest of 2 sons in his family. The family patriarch held conservative views, was quite strict, and even harsh with his children. Carlo's younger brother quickly became the parents' darling, constantly pampered and protected, while they demanded unquestioning obedience, stellar academic performance, and high achievements from their firstborn. From childhood, Carlo strived to meet his parents' expectations, always acting as instructed. He excelled academically, participated in volleyball, a sport his father chose for him despite Carlo's passion for soccer, and never argued with his father, who often stated that his house operated solely on his rules. It was easy to upset or anger their father, who became terrifying when enraged. So Carlo made it a point never to contradict him, always enviously observing his father's and mother's more affectionate treatment towards his younger brother. As a teenager, Carlo became nervous and withdrawn, dreaming of doing something on his own, yet fearing his father's wrath. His fears, internal struggles, and self-doubt affected his relationships with peers. Carlo had almost no friends at school, where he was seen as an uninteresting nerd, often openly bullied without the ability to defend himself, as his father had crushed his self-esteem and suppressed any desire to assert himself. Over time, Carlo learned to adapt and blend in. He avoided conflict, tried to merge with the crowd, and was superficially polite and kind even to those he despised. It seemed Carlo had lost his own emotions, or perhaps never had them. Laughing or mourning with others, His emotional responses always remained shallow because he never truly felt those emotions. Despite his troubled upbringing, after completing high school, Carlo enrolled in the economics faculty of a prestigious university. This choice, like so many others in his life, was dictated by his father, who saw economics as a respectable and lucrative field. Carlo, however, had no interest in numbers or finance. He was never consulted about his preferences, nor did he dare challenge his father's decision. Over time, he grew accustomed to acting against his own interests, prioritizing compliance over his own happiness. Physically, Carlo was strikingly attractive, a trait that didn't go unnoticed by those around him. Years of sports and regular gym sessions gave him an athletic build, while his dazzling smile and well-groomed appearance added to his charm. This handsomeness, paired with a superficial charisma, often drew people to him, though few could see beyond the surface. His looks led to a sense of self-importance, fostering excessive self-love, and what some would later describe as clinical narcissism. When Carlo met Christina, their contrasting personalities created an immediate spark. Christina's confidence and independence stood in stark contrast to Carlo's reserved and compliant nature. Yet, beneath his unassuming exterior, Carlo carried the seeds of something darker, traits that Christina, in her optimism, believed she could mend. Notable trait of Carlo was his remarkable skill in dodging uncomfortable questions. While he wasn't a pathological liar, his ability to prevaricate and evade made him an enigma to many. His impassive demeanor lent an air of credibility to his words, creating an illusion of honesty even when he wasn't forthcoming. People who knew Carlo personally later recalled his diminished capacity for empathy. He often came across as callous and indifferent to the troubles and sorrows of others, including those closest to him. His responses to emotional situations were superficial at best, suggesting a fundamental inability or unwillingness to connect on a deeper level. Carlo easily initiated flings with women, using his appearance and charm to his advantage. However, he was incapable of engaging in serious long-term relationships. There were several reasons for this. First, Carlo went out of his way to avoid responsibility. Second, he had no interest in making long-term plans, preferring to simply go with the flow. Third, his emotional shallowness and lack of real attachment became evident to his partners, who often chose to end the relationship. As a result, his romantic life was a series of brief, superficial encounters that rarely lasted more than a few months. Even after graduating from university, Carlo showed no desire to leave his parents' home. He continued living under their roof, displaying little interest in starting an independent life or building a family of his own. Despite this, he secured a job at a leading IT company in Milan. The position offered a good salary and promising prospects, but Carlo remained dissatisfied. His work felt unfulfilling, a sentiment he often kept to himself. His parents, however, were thrilled. For the first time, Carlo's father seemed genuinely proud of his eldest son, which only reinforced Carlo's reluctance to voice any discontent. Eager to avoid conflicts or criticism, he focused on meeting his parents' expectations, no matter the cost to his own aspirations. But career achievements alone weren't enough for Carlo's parents. They began pressuring him to marry and provide them with grandchildren. Aware of his numerous fleeting affairs and his inability to sustain a serious relationship, these conversations often led to arguments at home. Carlo, ever averse to confrontation, assured them he would find a wife and start a family soon. This reassurance, however, was little more than a way to deflect their demands and buy himself time. Carlo's life took a dramatic turn when he first laid eyes on Christina Omas during her performance in a musical play. Her powerful charisma and stunning vocal talent captivated him instantly. For the first time in years, Carlo felt something resembling admiration, though he lacked the courage to approach her after the show. Fate, however, had other plans. A few weeks later, mutual friends introduced them, setting the stage for a whirlwind romance. At the time of their meeting, Carlo was only 23, while Christina was already 30. The significant age difference didn't seem to matter as they quickly developed a strong connection. Christina, who had spent much of her life focusing on her career, found herself unexpectedly longing for a family and children. Carlo, with his good looks, career orientation, and intelligence, seemed like the perfect partner. She viewed his hesitancy, dependency, noticeable selfishness, and emotional coldness as challenges she could help him overcome. Taking the initiative in their relationship, Christina became the driving force behind their plans, while Carlo compliantly followed her lead. Their relationship progressed quickly, and within a few months, Christina introduced Carlo to her family. Her parents, however, were less than impressed. They saw Carlo as frivolous and immature, with Christina's mother describing him as a child in a man's body. She believed her daughter deserved a more emotionally mature and reliable partner, someone capable of providing genuine support. Christina, however, disagreed. True to her nature, she followed her heart, convinced that Carlo was the one for her. On the other hand, Carlo's parents were thrilled with their son's choice. Christina was seen as a responsible, accomplished, and self-sufficient woman who could compensate for Carlo's shortcomings. Even Carlo's father, who was notoriously difficult to please, approved of the relationship. This validation further convinced Carlo that he had made the right decision, even if he didn't fully understand what that decision entailed. About a year after meeting, the young couple moved in together and began actively planning their wedding. Carlo was quiet and compliant, always listening to his fiancée, never contradicting her, and carefully avoiding domestic disputes. Christina made all the decisions, while Carlo silently supported them. This arrangement suited her perfectly. She was confident that a long and happy life awaited them. She viewed Carlo's lack of initiative as endearing, believing it signaled his trust in her judgment. However, just before their wedding, Carlo revealed his true nature for the first time, nearly causing them to split. Before the wedding, Carlo's friends organized a bachelor party in one of Milan's popular nightclubs. The evening was filled with revelry as they drank, laughed, and celebrated Carlo's impending marriage. As the night wore on, a group of women joined their party. One of them, particularly bold and flirtatious, set her sights on the groom-to-be. Carlo, though initially reserved, was encouraged by his inebriated friends, who egged him on with crude jokes about enjoying one last fling before settling down. Yielding to peer pressure, Carlo left with the woman and spent a passionate night with her in a nearby hotel. The following morning, in a moment of emotional confusion, Carlo confessed his love to the casual lover, promising to leave his fiancée for her. Driven by an inexplicable urge to unburden himself, Carlo returned home and confessed everything to Christina. He told her he had fallen for someone else and no longer wanted to go through with the wedding. The revelation was a devastating blow. Christina handled the shocking news with remarkable dignity. She packed her belongings, determined not to plead or beg, and temporarily moved back to her parents' house while she looked for a place of her own. She believed the betrayal spoke volumes about Carlo's character and saw no future with him. When Carlo's father learned of his son's actions and the broken engagement, he was furious. He berated Carlo, declaring that he wouldn't allow his heir to ruin his reputation and that of their family. Carlo's father demanded that his son apologize to Christina and convince her to resume the engagement. Carlo, accustomed to submitting to his father's will, complied without hesitation. Armed with a massive bouquet of flowers, he went to the Omas residence to beg for Christina's forgiveness. Christina's parents, already disapproving of Carlo, were adamantly opposed to the reconciliation. They saw his behavior as proof of his immaturity and selfishness. However, Christina made the final decision. After much thought, she chose to forgive Carlo, convinced that everyone deserves a second chance. The wedding went ahead as planned, and the couple used the money gifted by relatives to purchase their own home in Visanti. For a while, their marital life appeared blissful. Both held high-ranking positions with substantial salaries, allowing them to enjoy not only life's necessities, but also luxuries such as travel and entertainment. In 2009, they welcomed their first child, a daughter named Giulia. 4 years later, in 2013, Christina gave birth to a son, Gabriel. To the outside world, the Lissis seemed like the epitome of a happy family. They projected an image of love and harmony, with Carlo playing the role of a devoted husband and father. Christina appeared content, confident that they had overcome their earlier challenges. But beneath this facade, Carlo was leading a double life. At home, he was the perfect family man, spending time with his wife and children and carefully maintaining an image of stability. However, in Milan, where he commuted daily for work, Carlo transformed into someone entirely different. He frequently engaged in flings and casual encounters, meeting women in cafes, shopping centers, or even on the street. The handsome, stylishly dressed man in his expensive car almost always received reciprocated interest. But these affairs typically ended after a few dates. Carlo enjoyed the control and dominance in these short-term relationships, deciding when to see his next conquest and when to leave her. At home, Christina continued to hold the reins of their relationship. Carlo's compliance masked his inner dissatisfaction, which he kept hidden from his wife. He justified his infidelities as harmless distractions, convincing himself that his actions didn't truly affect his family. However, rumors of his escapades eventually reached Christina. She confronted him on multiple occasions, but Carlo vehemently denied the accusations, dismissing them as baseless gossip. In 2013, shortly after Gabriel's birth, Carlo's dissatisfaction reached a tipping point. He seriously contemplated leaving his family for one of his mistresses. Emboldened by his feelings for the woman, he admitted his intentions to Christina. However, Christina responded with compelling arguments against separation. She emphasized the emotional toll it would take on their children and how the decision would devastate Carlo's parents. Carlo, who could never bear to disappoint his father, ultimately conceded to her reasoning. Once again, he chose the path of least resistance, suppressing his desires in favor of preserving appearances. A year later, in early 2014, a new employee named Maria joined Carlo's workplace. Young, attractive, and vibrant, Maria's presence immediately caught Carlo's attention. He became infatuated, unable to think of anything or anyone else. Her youth and energy contrasted sharply with what he perceived as the mundane routines of his married life. Carlo, captivated, began making attempts to win her over, gifting small tokens of appreciation, offering excessive compliments, and persistently asking her out. Maria, however, was firm in her refusals. She made it clear that she had no interest in pursuing a relationship with a married co-worker who had 2 children. But Carlo, unwilling to accept rejection, ignored her boundaries and continued his relentless pursuit. Carlo's obsession with Maria deepened. His perception of his own life began to sour. He started viewing his wife, Christina, and their children as the central barriers to his happiness. What once was love and responsibility now felt, to Carlo, like confinement and resentment. In his mind, Maria symbolized freedom, passion, and a chance at a fresh start, a life unburdened by the demands of marriage and fatherhood. These fantasies consumed him, and his growing resentment toward Christina and their children left him increasingly detached from the family that had once been his entire world. In a desperate attempt to make his fantasies a reality, Carlo brought up the subject of divorce with Christina once again. He hoped that she would finally relent and grant him an escape from what he had come to see as a suffocating existence. Christina, however, was as practical and family-oriented as ever. She dismissed the idea, arguing that divorce would not only shatter their seemingly stable life, but also wreak emotional havoc on their children. To her, their family unit was sacred, and she believed that working through their struggles together was the only viable option. Carlo, unable to counter her logic, reluctantly conceded, though his frustration and resentment festered beneath the surface. Unwilling to let go of his dream of a new life, Carlo began consulting divorce lawyers in secret. His intention was to find a way out of his marriage that would allow him to pursue Maria without losing everything. Legal consultations revealed that separating from Christina would be financially disastrous. Under the law, half of his assets would become hers, and he would be obligated to pay substantial child support for Julia and Gabriel. For a man already consumed by selfish fantasies, the financial burden of divorce was simply unacceptable. Frustrated and unwilling to compromise his imagined future, Carlo's thoughts turned dark. Late at night, while Christina and the children slept, he began researching ways to eliminate his problem. He delved into criminal stories and forums, looking for inspiration. One case in particular caught his attention: an armed robbery in Mav Visanti, where the perpetrators had fatally stabbed the homeowner before escaping undetected. The crime remained unsolved, and Carlo began to envision how he could recreate such a scenario to solve his own predicament. A monstrous plan began to take shape, one where Christina and the children would be the victims, and Carlo would emerge free to start a new life. Friday, June 13th, 2014, began like any other day for the Lissi family. Carlo, who had taken the day off from work, made a deliberate decision to spend it with his family. Their day unfolded with visits to an amusement park, a shopping spree at the local mall, and a delightful dinner at a popular cafe in town. Carlo was particularly meticulous in orchestrating their activities to ensure they were seen by as many people as possible, carefully curating the image of a happy and loving family. Observers noted their genuine joy and the harmonious interactions that seemed to epitomize familial bliss. Upon returning home, the evening continued with routine as the children were tucked into their rooms on the second floor, their peaceful slumber undisturbed. Carlo and Christina then retreated to the living room, sharing an intimate moment. This encounter was a calculated maneuver by Carlo, designed to create a facade of consensual intimacy. His strategy was cunning. He was convinced that no one would suspect a man who had been visibly affectionate and physically close to his wife. As the night progressed, Christina believed that Carlo was preparing to leave for a soccer match with his friends, a regular occurrence that she expected. She settled into the living room to watch television, completely unaware of the impending horror that would shatter her sense of security and trust. According to investigators who later delved into the details of the case, Carlo did not leave the house as Christina had assumed. Instead, he quietly moved to the kitchen and retrieved a large knife. With calculated silence, he approached Christina from behind and stabbed her in the side of the neck. To his surprise, Christina did not succumb immediately. She let out a scream and attempted to flee, initially unaware of her attacker's identity. When she turned to see Carlo standing there with the knife, her expression transformed into one of utter disbelief and terror. Christina fought back with every ounce of strength she possessed. In the ensuing struggle, she managed to dislodge the knife, causing Carlo's hand to slip and injure his palm. Despite her valiant efforts, the strength disparity between them proved too great. Carlo seized the knife once more and continued his brutal assault until Christina collapsed, lifeless. Her final moments were engulfed in confusion and fear, unable to comprehend why the man she had trusted so deeply had betrayed her so violently. Fueled by adrenaline, Carlo then proceeded upstairs to the children's rooms. He first entered Giulia's room, his daughter, and then Gabriel's room, his son. Both children were asleep, unaware of the nightmare unfolding around them. Carlo methodically slit their throats with clinical precision, ensuring that their deaths were instantaneous and sparing them the trauma of witnessing their mother's murder. Experts later concluded that their deaths were swift, preventing them from experiencing the horror that had befallen their family. Some neighbors later confessed to hearing muffled screams that night, but none took immediate action by calling the police. They assumed the noises had ceased and dismissed them as insignificant, an inaction that, while understandable, sealed the family's tragic fate. With his grisly task complete, Carlo turned his attention to staging the scene to resemble a robbery. He scattered items, moved furniture, and even attempted to wipe his fingerprints from the murder weapon. However, his efforts were poorly executed and incomplete. He managed to clean the bloodstains from the floor where he had stepped, but failed to notice the tiny splatters on his clothing. Exhausted, he made his way to a rarely used basement shower to cleanse himself of the immediate evidence. In a perplexing oversight, Carlo put back on the same shirt he had worn during the murders, which bore small blood splatters that he had failed to notice amid the chaos of his actions. This crucial mistake would later become a significant piece of evidence against him. Following this, Carlo bandaged the cut on his palm, a wound sustained during his violent struggle with Christina, before methodically dressing in clean clothes. He then left the house and headed to a nearby sports bar to watch a football match and enjoy a beer with friends. To any observer, Carlo appeared entirely normal. He laughed, cheered, and engaged in casual conversations, blending seamlessly with the lively crowd. His friends, who were later called to testify in court, were shocked upon learning about the heinous crime he had committed just hours earlier. They described him as calm and jovial that evening, unable to reconcile his outward demeanor with the horrific acts he had carried out. Towards the end of the match, Carlo sent several text messages to his wife's phone. In them, he updated her on the score and even professed his love, writing that he would be home soon. These messages were part of his carefully constructed alibi, designed to reinforce the illusion that he had been at the sports bar all night, unaware of the tragedy unfolding at home. Carlo returned to his house around 3 a.m. and staged a dramatic discovery of the crime scene. Running out into the street, he began screaming loudly, his cries piercing the quiet of the early morning. The commotion quickly attracted the attention of his neighbors, many of whom woke up and rushed outside to investigate. Alarmed, the neighbors called the police and emergency medical services. While waiting for authorities to arrive, The emergency operator instructed Carlo to check if his family members had a pulse and to perform CPR if there were any signs of life. Carlo's response was chilling. He screamed that he would not step inside the house again or touch the bodies. His reaction, while perhaps attributable to shock, struck many as peculiar. Even more unsettling was the fact that he referred to his family as bodies before anyone had officially confirmed their deaths. When police and medical personnel arrived and officially pronounced Christina and the children dead, Carlo's behavior raised further suspicions. He barely reacted to the devastating news, his face a mask of indifference. Attempts to feign grief were unconvincing. He contorted his features as though trying to cry, but his eyes remained dry and his demeanor oddly detached. When questioned about the events of the night, Carlo struggled to provide a coherent timeline. His statements were riddled with inconsistencies, and he seemed unable to recall even basic details about his movements. Adding to the growing suspicion, Carlo confessed to having recorded the discovery of the crime scene on his phone. He asserted that the footage would serve as undeniable proof of his innocence, capturing his genuine reaction upon finding the bodies of his family members. However, this ill-conceived strategy disastrously backfired. The video, which Carlo had neglected to stop recording, contradicted his testimony in several crucial aspects. The footage clearly showed that he did not approach Christina's body to check for a pulse, nor did he ascend the stairs to evaluate the condition of the children. Instead, he immediately fled the scene, running outside in an exaggerated display of panic that seemed more performative than genuine. Carlo's initial assertion that the murders were the result of a robbery was swiftly dismissed during the preliminary stages of the investigation. A thorough forensic examination of the crime scene revealed no evidence of forced entry. All doors and windows were found to be intact, indicating that the perpetrator had unimpeded access to the house. Additionally, nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. Christina's jewelry box, cash, and other valuables remained untouched, and the disarray within the home appeared to be artificially staged. Items were toppled or displaced in a manner that suggested no sincere attempt to search for valuables. Perhaps most damning of all was the absence of any credible motive for intruders to harm the children, who had been peacefully asleep in their beds at the time of the attack. As the evidence continued to accumulate, the case was rapidly reclassified from a possible robbery to a deliberate act of homicide, with Carlo emerging as the primary suspect. His inconsistent and contradictory statements did little to bolster his defense. When questioned about the fresh cut on his palm, Carlo provided a feeble explanation, claiming that he had injured himself while hastily running out of the house. However, forensic analysis of his clothing revealed tiny blood splatters on the back of his shirt, a pattern that was consistent with the motion of the knife during the attack and impossible to reconcile with his narrative of fleeing the scene. The video Carlo had provided to the authorities further undermined his defense, as it showed that he never attempted to check for signs of life, directly contradicting his claims of discovering his family already deceased. Despite this overwhelming evidence, Carlo maintained that he had found his family dead and was certain that they had been killed with a knife. Investigators also uncovered a bloodied cloth in the trash, which Carlo had used to clean up after the murders. This, along with the bloodstains on his underwear and the inconsistencies in the staging of the crime scene, ultimately sealed his fate. Following his arrest, Carlo's attempts to feign grief completely ceased. Once in custody, he exhibited an eerie calmness, showing no signs of guilt or remorse. In his cell, he simply lay down and went to sleep, presenting a chilling contrast to the horrific acts he had committed just hours earlier. Carlo's indifference extended to his interrogations, where he steadfastly maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Investigators observed his lack of emotion when discussing his wife and children, describing him as cold and detached. A meticulous reconstruction of Carlo's search history, derived from the data on his seized laptop, provided investigators with a chilling timeline of his descent into planning the murders of his family. The search queries included investigations into untraceable poisons, detailed anatomy of fatal wounds, and in-depth accounts of other violent crimes. Each search, each click, delved deeper into his malicious intent, leaving no doubt that the murders were premeditated. Despite this clear evidence of planning, the underlying motive for Carlo's actions remained an unsettling mystery that perplexed investigators and the community alike. As the weight of the irrefutable evidence bore down on him, Carlo eventually abandoned his facade of innocence. Recognizing the futility of further denial, he began to confess. His calm, almost clinical explanation of how he had murdered his loved ones sent shockwaves through the room. Carlo recounted each step of the crime without displaying any emotion, describing the acts as though they were routine events. However, it was his justification, his motive, that truly horrified everyone present. They spoke of a twisted sense of control and a misguided belief that he was acting in the best interest of his family, painting a disturbing picture of his warped psyche. Explaining why he decided to murder his family, Carlo revealed that he felt trapped by his obligations. Divorce, in his mind, was an unacceptable option. He reasoned that ending his marriage would require him to split their jointly acquired property, including the house, cars, and the family bank account. Such a loss was intolerable to him. Additionally, Carlo saw his children as burdens, citing the child support payments he would owe as another insurmountable obstacle to his imagined happiness with Maria. He viewed his family not as people he loved or cared for, but as liabilities that needed to be eliminated. To Carlo, the solution was horrifyingly simple: commit a crime, stage a robbery, and free himself from the life he had come to resent. He did not hesitate, did not stammer. His tone was eerily calm as he explained how he had justified such horrific actions to himself. The investigators listening to his confession were struck by the absence of remorse in his words. He showed no pity for his children, no sorrow for his wife, and no acknowledgement of the profound loss he had caused. Psychiatrists who examined Carlo concluded that he was a psychopath, a man entirely devoid of empathy. However, they also determined that he was sane at the time of the crime. The psychiatric evaluation confirmed that Carlo was fully aware of his actions and understood the consequences of what he was doing. He had planned the murders with clear intent and executed them with chilling precision. What he lacked entirely was guilt or regret. At no point during or after the crime did Carlo experience even a flicker of remorse. As the investigation progressed, more details about Carlo's behavior emerged. Friends and acquaintances recalled moments where his lack of empathy had been subtly apparent, though never alarming enough to raise red flags. He was described as charming but shallow, a man who could feign interest and emotion but rarely formed deep connections. In hindsight, many realized that his charm was a facade, a tool he used to manipulate those around him. Despite his stoicism, Carlo attempted to defend his actions during the trial. He repeatedly emphasized his belief that he had been left with no other choice, portraying himself as a victim of circumstances that had relentlessly cornered him. His father was the central figure in this tragic history, a man whose constant attacks, both verbal and emotional, had started in his early childhood and continued into adulthood. These assaults went beyond mere criticism. They were deeply ingrained patterns of control and domination that eroded his sense of autonomy. Every decision in his life, he claimed, had been overshadowed by his father's oppressive influence. This ceaseless interference, he argued, stripped him of the ability to chart his own path, fostering a deep-seated resentment and a sense of helplessness that grew over the years. In January 2015, Carlo was sentenced to life in prison. He listened to the judge's verdict indifferently, noting only that he thought so. Sometime later, the man tried to file an appeal, but soon withdrew it himself, saying that it was all useless. Finally, Lissi's father died of a heart attack shortly after his son was convicted and sent to prison. He simply could not accept the fact that he had raised a real monster, devoid of a sense of pity and remorse.